Well, let's get into the details of this with Peter Schiff. He's the president and CEO of Euro-Pacific Capital, and he joins us from Connecticut. Peter, just in simple terms, because this is a complex story with bonds and debts involved, can you explain to us how Puerto Rico can default on some of its debt and yet still essentially keep the lights on for the time being?
Well, it's actually a pretty simple story because a lot of governments around the world have made the same mistake, and a lot of creditors have made the mistake of loaning the money. But, you know, the United States government played a big part in aiding Puerto Rico in borrowing all this money because we made all of the debt that the Puerto Rican government issues triple tax-free in all the U.S. states. So we created tremendous demand for yield-seeking investors who really didn't care about risk or didn't even know enough about it to ask the questions. And then the Federal Reserve brought interest rates to zero, left them there for 7 years. And so Americans couldn't get enough of these Puerto Rican bonds. And then the Puerto Rican politicians, this was great for them because they could promise something for nothing to Puerto Rican voters. A lot of them were government employees, and so they promised a lot more than their tax base could deliver. And you know, creditors finally woke up, and the country is broke, it's not a country, it's a possession of the United States, but they are broke, and at least the governor admitted that it's impossible to repay. But you know, the irony is the United States is actually more broke than Puerto Rico. It's just that we have a printing press and they don't.
Well, the U.S. aside in the U.S. finance, is there a moral case, Peter, for the U.S. stepping in and essentially wiping the slate clean for Puerto Rico? After all, these are U.S. passport holders.
No, I mean, there's never a moral case for a bailout like that. I mean, it's immoral. It's basically theft. But I think what the United States needs to do is recognize that it's partially responsible for the plight of Puerto Rico and actually do something to help, like allow Puerto Rico to go through a bankruptcy just like any city in the United States that is indebted over its head, so it can restructure its debts honestly through the legal system. And then, of course, the United States can make it easier for Puerto Rico to dig itself out of this hole by sparing it from the minimum wage law that we imposed on Puerto Rico that's much too high for the island. We could repeal the Jones Act that makes it extremely expensive to ship goods in and out of Puerto Rico. There are all sorts of ways that we are undermining the Puerto Rican economy. We can stop that. We can end the welfare state, which is enticing so many Puerto Ricans not to work. And if we want to give tax breaks, why don't we just make the interest or dividends on private investments, not to the Puerto Rican government, but to private companies, to entrepreneurs? We can exempt them from tax.
I think the governor of Puerto Rico might say to you there is a moral case here. He said recently in Washington, D.C., that Wall Street had won. He's essentially saying that all those finance people who'd made a lot of money from those debts had essentially won. So I think he would say to you there is a moral case for the U.S. coming in and trying to help Puerto Rico in some way.
The bailout wouldn't help Puerto Rico. It would enrich all the hedge fund speculators who bought up that Puerto Rican debt for pennies on the dollar. You know, what's the point of using taxpayer money and funneling it to hedge funds through Puerto Rico? All Puerto Rico needs to do is restructure, and so the hedge funds that bought that paper will take a loss. I mean, why impose the losses on American taxpayers? Impose them on the people who are dumb enough to buy those bonds. Don't allow them to use their political connections to rip off the American taxpayer. But I don't think we should force Puerto Rico to repay these debts. The debts are impayable, and Puerto Rican politicians never should have borrowed that money. But that's the problem with democracy. But unfortunately, we made it so easy for the Puerto Rican government to borrow all that money, and that needs to end. We need to end all these moral hazards. One of them, of course, are bailouts. But we don't want to bail out the hedge funds, and that's really what we're discussing. It's not a bailout for Puerto Rico. It's a bailout for wealthy people who speculated in their debt.
One final one for you, Peter, just briefly. Could you see Puerto Rico sort of struggling through the next year or so, a bit like Greece has done, where it's given just about enough money to get by?
Well, I would rather not be the case. I mean, they're struggling to make some of the interest payments now, and they've made most of them. But I'd rather have a restructuring sooner than later so Puerto Rico's economy can start growing. You know, I've got a business in Puerto Rico, Euro-Pacific Bank. You can see, Euro-Pacific Asset Management, rather, is my asset management company. And I moved it to Puerto Rico from California in 2012. And I think a lot of other entrepreneurs like myself will move to Puerto Rico to take advantage of more favorable tax laws
Peter,
that
I'm
exist
sorry to cut
on the island than in the United States.